Welcome, everyone. It's your host, Danny Haifong. Thank you for tuning in to a special morning live. I'm going to get right started with Professor Jeffrey Sachs right now. Then we're going to have Victor Gao come on later, and then Professor Richard Wolff. What have been your thoughts about this BRICS summit and where it is taking the world, geopolitics, and in particular, this question of Russia being isolated?
Well, maybe it's a good place to start with the West, so-called. What do we mean by the West? It's not exactly a geographical description. It means essentially the U.S.-led alliance in the world, mainly a military alliance, but also, of course, an economic alliance of sorts. And the West is the United States and Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and a handful of other countries. And when you add it up, it's not a lot of the world. As I mentioned, 27 EU countries, Canada and the United States makes 29, Britain makes 30, Japan, Korea, 32, Australia, New Zealand makes 34. Throw in another 6 or so, you could throw in another 10 tiny island economies around the world that are, for one reason or another, tied to the U.S. or even in formal ways, like Micronesia. But when you add up the population, the U.S. is 335 million people, the EU 450 million people, that's 800 million. Add in the rest, and maybe you're at 1.1 or 1.2 billion people in the West. And that is in an 8 billion person world, about 15% of the world population. So where are the rest of the people? Well, of course, China and India, that's 2.8 billion right there. Africa, another 1.4 billion, that's 4.2 billion. So the African Union plus India plus China is more than half the world. And they're not part of the West. And when you then add in the rest of the developing world, the ASEAN countries, for example, 10 countries in Southeast Asia with a population of about 800 million people, the Central Asian countries, the West Asian countries, which are basically the Arab countries of the Middle East, plus Iran and a few others. Well, this is where the other 85% of the world ends up being, and they're not part of the Western world. There has been, of course, a certain hubris of the West for a long time. I'd say it's at least 200 years old that the West runs the world. That's coming to an end because not only do the population numbers not add up, but the GDP numbers don't add up either anymore. If you measure GDP, as I think is appropriate in many contexts, by what we call purchasing power adjusted dollars, China is already 25 or 30% larger than the United States economy. I have a general point, which is that the U.S. has been the main hegemon in the world for the basically nearly 80 years since the end of World War II. But that period's over. I personally do not believe that China will be the new hegemon. I think we are now in a truly multipolar world. There will be a number of major powers, the United States remaining one of them, the EU, if it holds together, being one, Russia, China, India, and maybe the African Union in 20 years will look like a geostrategic leader as well. It's not impossible. So I think we're in a multipolar world. I don't think that the West is going away, or I don't think that it's going to succumb to China's dominance, because I don't think, first of all, that China wants dominance. I don't think it's possible for China to be the world hegemon in any event, not in a military sense and not in many other senses. And it's an important footnote to add that China's population today is 1.4 billion, but by the end of the century, it could well be below 1 billion because the fertility rates are so far below replacement level that China's population has peaked and is now declining. And of course, things depend on fertility rates in future decades, but I think it's right to say that the population will decline. It will age in terms of average age or median age. And I don't see China, therefore, wanting or able or motivated or just having to happen that China becomes the new hegemon. The same is kind of true with the dollar. The dollar has been the hegemonic currency, not unrelated to America's political hegemony as well. It will no longer be the hegemonic currency. There will be multiple currencies. I don't think the renminbi will supplant the dollar, but it will absolutely live alongside the dollar as a major world currency. The U.S. government has been absolutely obnoxious in how it's misused money. It's a privilege when other countries use your money. You get to borrow very cheap, by the way, even just printing notes that they hold because they're dealing with your currency. So you get what we call seigniorage returns. But if you suddenly go out and confiscate the bank holdings of other governments, like we did with Russia, freezing $300 billion of Russian government assets, or you do that with Venezuela, or you do that with Iran, or you do that with Afghanistan, well, there are many ways to transact. You don't have to hold dollars. And if I were not on good terms with the USG as being a different government, I wouldn't hold dollars either.
India's business community, CEOs of major industries, perhaps putting pressure on India and the Indian government to not only come to BRICS, but also to engage in these talks because, and I'm curious on your assessment of this, Mr. Gao, there has been a lot of collapsed economic cooperation between India and China, especially since 2020. And this includes a huge deal with China's burgeoning and booming electric vehicle industry, which India has rejected ever since 2020, any investment in that. So I'm curious on what you believe are the economic factors perhaps pushing this, because a lot of BRICS and BRICS development with China and Russia, India leading the way, development is the big key question here. And I'm curious on your thoughts on how development and cooperation and maybe the pressures to do so and to re-engage in it factored into this ultimate result, which is being a bit underplayed, actually, I believe, in the Western media.
Well, if we look objectively at China and India today, one most important common denominator is the size of their population. Each is more than 1.4 billion people. That means both China and India have huge amounts of challenges at home to make sure employment is catching up and poverty will be reduced and opportunities for economic development will be seized very forcefully, etc. But other than that, China and India as of today are completely two different countries. Now, in terms of the size of the economy, China's economy is about 5 times larger than India, whereas China has a complete whole range of industrial outputs, including everything that's being recognized by the United Nations, for example. India's range of economic development is relatively limited. And whereas China is really pushing the edge of the envelope in terms of science and technology development and is really capturing the forefront of human endeavors in many areas, India, relatively speaking, is still lagging behind. Now, that means China and India really need to engage with each other because there is high level of complementarity between the Chinese economy and the Indian economy. And if China and India can really get their acts together their cooperation will have huge potentials.
What I believe the United States has been attempting to do, which is to divide India and China as not only rivals, but also portraying India as a potential partner in weakening and containing China. So I'm curious on your thoughts about this.
Well, the best I can read in U.S. engagement with India is as follows. I don't think the United States really cares about the fundamental interest of the Indian people or of the Indian government. What the United States really cares about is try its best to bind India onto the bandwagon of the United States in terms of anti-China hostility, and preferably even to instigate a confrontation directly between China and India. And the United States is not really putting into a lot of money to support India's economic development. And to the extent there is US contribution to India, it's very much designed to arm India in such a way that India will become more and more of a counterweight against China. Or, for example, if a war or confrontation can be instigated between China and India, and the United States will be the ultimate beneficiary. Now, I think the US positioning about India is fundamentally flawed because of one thing, because I truly respect the Indian people for their insistence on their independence of foreign policy, of non-alignment, for example, of refusing to subjugate India to the dictate of any other big power. Now, if the United States believe that they can really dictate the terms to India and force India onto the bandwagon of hostility against China, I don't think the American government will ever achieve that goal, because the Indian people and the Indian government really have their independence of the mind. They don't want to lose the sanity of their own judgment to the dictate of another third power. They were ruled by the British for a couple of centuries, for example, as second-class citizens, and they do not want to repeat that sad history in their past, and they want to always be the master of their own destiny, controlling the future of their own country and economic development.
We now are seeing not just the failure of sanctions, but also Russia being an economic engine for economic development worldwide. So how did this happen, and how have sanctions played a role in perhaps this backfiring of NATO and US policy toward Russia and the rest of the world?
Well, if ever you wanted an example of the notion of unintended consequences, here you have it. The last thing that the United States' neocon foreign policy establishment wanted was to strengthen Russia. They seem to have decided that Russia is the great problem in the world, and that they would concentrate on damaging, weakening Russia. That's a major part, not only of the war in Ukraine, but particularly of the economic side of it, sanctions program of stopping purchases of oil and gas by Europe from Russia. Russia provided the cheapest oil and gas that Europe could have found anywhere. Because of the cheapness, European products were lower priced. They didn't have to raise the price as much because they got the cheap energy. And that made European economies successful, competitive, able to export, which the engine of European growth has been, Germany, above all, as an exporter. All of that was undercut when the sanctions went into effect in order to weaken Russia. But they didn't work. And they didn't work for two reasons that will help everyone understand why BRICS is so important. The first reason that those policies didn't work is that Russia was able to turn to its BRICS partners its BRICS allies, with whom Russia had been developing relationships for many years. BRICS wasn't an organization formed last year or the year before. It's older. And Russia had cultivated, in lots of ways, relationships with India, China, South Africa, Brazil, the people who make up, the countries that make up BRICS. And so they bought Russian oil and gas, to make a complex story short and sweet. And Russia wasn't weakened. Russia turned out to be strengthened. The second unintended consequence was that Russia strengthened itself by turning to the BRICS, but it was a two-way arrangement. In order for India and China to buy the oil and gas from Russia, they had to work out the economics of this enormous business imposed on them by the sanctions levied by the United States and its G7 Europe allies, plus Japan. And so the BRICS became better coordinated, more dependent one on the other, more having their economies intertwined. Bottom line, Russia and the BRICS became stronger, and the United States became less powerful because of it, more isolated because of their own decisions to have the war in Ukraine, which wasn't necessary. And that isolation of the United States is now deepening because of its decision to be as supportive unilaterally to Israel as they have decided to be. The unintended consequence of trying to isolate Russia has been to isolate the United States. And that leads me to perhaps the most important point. The world has changed, and the United States is denying that to its own detriment. The BRICS is now a larger economic powerhouse than is the United States or the G7. China is coming closer and closer to being an economic equivalent of the United States, as everyone knows.